In this episode, we are looking at workstation hardening, which simply means making a computer harder to misuse, harder to break into, and harder to damage through common mistakes. For a beginner, this is one of the most useful security ideas to understand because many real problems do not start with advanced attacks. They start with weak passwords, unlocked accounts, careless startup settings, or services running that nobody truly needs. A workstation can look perfectly normal on the desk and still be easier to compromise than it should be if those basic settings are left loose. The good news is that small choices at login, firmware, and service level can make a very real difference. Hardening is not about turning the computer into something painful to use. It is about taking away easy opportunities so that a simple guess, a casual mistake, or an avoidable misconfiguration does not become the reason the whole system is exposed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.News in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to understand workstation hardening is to think about layers of access. One layer is the login itself, which decides how easily someone can get into the account. Another layer is the system startup level, where firmware settings decide what happens before the operating system even loads. Another layer is the background activity inside the operating system, where services may be listening, starting automatically, or offering features that are useful in some cases but risky in others. A technician does not need to know every advanced security product to make a workstation safer. Very often, what matters most is controlling the easy paths. If a password is weak, if unlimited guesses are allowed, if the machine can be started from the wrong source, or if unnecessary services are left running, then the computer has more doors open than it needs. Hardening means closing those extra doors before someone takes advantage of them. Strong passwords are one of the most basic parts of hardening, but they still matter because they are often the first barrier between the user account and anyone who should not be there. A weak password makes every other security setting less valuable because it gives an attacker, a coworker, or even a curious family member a simpler way in. For beginners, the main point is that strong passwords are not strong because they look complicated in a random way. They are strong because they are hard to guess, hard to reuse from old breaches, and hard to crack through repeated attempts. A password based on a pet name, a birthday, the word password, or a short predictable pattern is weak even if it feels personal or familiar to the user. A technician should understand that a strong password helps protect the whole session behind it. If the login fails, then the attacker does not get the desktop, the files, the browser sessions, or the saved access that comes after the sign-in. It also helps beginners to understand what makes a password weak in the real world. People often pick something easy to remember, then use the same pattern again and again across many accounts. They may add one number at the end, change one letter, or rotate between a few favorites and assume that counts as security. The problem is that weak habits are predictable, and predictability is exactly what an attacker wants. A technician should not explain this in a way that sounds dramatic or insulting. It is enough to say that many users choose what is fast and familiar often means easy to guess. A stronger password gives better protection because it does not rely on obvious personal details or common patterns. In workstation hardening, that matters because the login is one of the most exposed parts of the whole system. If the password is easy, then the machine is easier to misuse before any deeper protection even has a chance to matter. Strong password practice also matters because workstations often hold more access than users realize. A signed-in session may already have email open, browser sessions saved, file shares available, cloud apps connected, and documents stored locally. That means a compromised login is not just access to a blank desktop. It is often access to many other things that trust the user once the user is signed in. For beginners, this is a very important connection. A password is not protecting only the keyboard and screen. It is protecting everything the workstation can reach while that user is active. That is why technicians should care about password quality even when users say nobody would want anything on their machine. The attacker may not care about that one laptop by itself. The attacker may care about the accounts, stored sessions, and network access that the laptop can provide once the password barrier is gone. Account lockout settings add another important layer because they help stop repeated password guessing. If a system allows endless login attempts with no consequence, then even a somewhat decent password becomes easier to attack over time. A lockout policy places limits on that process by slowing it down or temporarily blocking more guesses after too many failures. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest examples of how a small setting can create a large security effect. The user may barely think about it on a normal day, but that same setting becomes very important the moment someone starts guessing passwords at the login screen or through a connected access point. A workstation with sensible lockout behavior is harder to brute force because the machine refuses to keep playing along. That makes password guessing less practical and gives the organization or technician a better chance to notice that something suspicious is happening. At the same time, lockout settings need balance because hardening is not the same thing as making the system unusable. If the lockout rules are far too aggressive, normal users may keep locking themselves out through small mistakes, which creates support problems and wasted time. If the rules are too loose, attackers get too many chances to guess. A beginner should learn that security often works best in the middle ground where the system discourages abuse without punishing normal use too harshly. That means the technician should understand the purpose of lockouts, not just the fact that they exist. The goal is to slow down repeated guessing and make the attack less practical, while still letting real users recover from ordinary typing mistakes. This is a good example of hardening as a practical support skill. It is not about setting everything to the most extreme value. It is about choosing settings that reduce preventable compromise while still supporting real work. Password hardening and lockout settings fit together because one protects the quality of the secret and the other protects the system from repeated guessing against that secret. If either one is weak, the login layer becomes easier to attack. A strong password with no lockout still gives an attacker endless chances. A lockout setting with a weak password still leaves the account too easy to guess in the first place. That is why technicians should not think of these as separate topics that happen to be near each other in the objectives. They are two parts of the same defense at the login level. For beginners, the lesson is simple. A workstation becomes safer when the password is strong and the system also reacts sensibly to too many failed attempts. That way, the machine is protected both by the difficulty of the password itself and by the limits placed on guessing behavior. Small settings at sign-in really do matter because sign-in is where many attacks and many bad support choices begin. Now it helps to move below the operating system and talk about firmware settings, which are often referred to with the term Basic Input-Output System, BIOS. Even though many modern systems use newer firmware designs, people still often say BIOS when talking about the startup settings that control what the machine does before Windows fully loads. For beginners, the important idea is that these settings matter because they shape the computer's early behavior. If those settings are left loose, an attacker with physical access may have more options than they should. A workstation can be hardened at the login screen and still have weak startup controls underneath. That is why technicians need to see firmware as part of security, not just as a place for hardware options. The machine begins making trust decisions before the user sees the desktop, and those early decisions can affect whether someone can bypass, alter, or misuse the system more easily. One common reason BIOS settings matter is boot control. If a workstation can be started from other sources too easily, then someone with physical access may try to use that path to get around normal protections or to interact with the storage in ways the user did not expect. For a beginner, the lesson is not about memorizing every firmware option. It is about understanding that startup behavior affects trust. The computer should begin in the expected way, from the expected internal source, under the expected rules. If outside boot paths are left open without a real need, the system may be giving away more flexibility than security allows. In a normal office or school setting, most users do not need to change startup devices all the time. That means limiting unnecessary boot options can reduce an avoidable risk. It is a small choice in a menu that many users never see, but it can still have a large effect on how hard the workstation is to tamper with. Firmware passwords or administrative protections at that level can also matter because they help stop casual changes to those startup settings. Without that protection, someone who reaches the machine physically may be able to alter startup behavior, loosen controls, or make changes the normal user never notices until later. For beginners, this is a strong reminder that workstation security is not only about what happens after Windows loads. Physical access changes the picture. If a person can sit down at the machine and change key low-level settings freely, then the system may be easier to misuse than the user realizes. A technician should not assume that every workstation needs the most restrictive firmware policy possible, but the technician should understand why those controls exist. They help preserve trust in how the machine starts, and they reduce the chance that simple physical access becomes an easy path to bypassing stronger settings higher up in the operating system. Hardening at the service level is another area where small decisions matter a lot. Services are background functions that help the operating system or applications do their work. Some are necessary, some are useful, and some may be present even when the user does not need them. From a security point of view, every unnecessary active service is one more thing that could be misused, attacked, or misconfigured. A beginner should hear service control and think about reducing extra activity that does not belong. If a workstation is running services that support features nobody uses, remote functions nobody needs, or old software that should not still be there, then the machine has a larger attack surface than necessary. Hardening means asking a simple question. Does this service need to be running on this workstation for this user in this environment? If the answer is no, then leaving it active may create more risk than benefit. This does not mean technicians should start disabling services at random. That creates a different kind of problem because important functions can break, updates can fail, and the user may lose tools they actually depend on. Beginner technicians need to understand that service hardening is about control, not guesswork. The safest habit is to know that unnecessary services increase exposure and that the right response is thoughtful reduction, not blind shutdown. A service that listens for connections, supports remote control, or interacts with system resources should not be left running simply because nobody has reviewed it recently. At the same time, technicians should respect that many services are necessary for ordinary system use. Hardening works when the system runs what it needs and avoids running what it does not need. That simple idea has a big security effect because fewer active components usually means fewer easy places for trouble to begin. When you put these pieces together, workstation hardening becomes much easier to understand. Strong passwords protect the login from being too easy to guess. Lockout settings stop endless guessing attempts from continuing without limits. BIOS controls help protect the way the machine starts and reduce easy physical tampering paths. Service control reduces unnecessary background activity that could create extra risk. None of these steps is flashy, and that is exactly why they are often ignored until something goes wrong. But support work is full of examples where the boring settings matter most. A guessed password, an unlimited number of sign-in tries, a loose startup path, or an old unnecessary service may be all it takes for a preventable compromise to happen. Beginners should see this clearly. Hardening is often about taking ordinary settings seriously before they become part of an incident. It is also helpful to remember that workstation hardening supports both security and support quality. A hardened machine is not just harder for attackers to misuse. It is often easier for technicians to trust and manage because fewer unnecessary paths are left open. When a workstation follows stronger login practices, sensible lockout behavior, controlled startup rules, and limited background services, there are fewer weak spots to explain later. This helps users too, even if they do not notice it every day. Many security settings feel invisible when everything is working normally, but that quiet normal behavior is part of the goal. A workstation should not need a dramatic story to prove it was protected well. In many cases, good hardening simply means the easy attack never worked, the bad guess never kept going, the tampering never got far, and the extra service never gave the wrong person a chance to begin. As we close, the most important lesson is that workstation hardening is built from simple choices that close simple opportunities. Strong passwords make the account harder to guess. Lockout settings make repeated guessing less practical. BIOS protections help control what happens before the operating system loads and make physical tampering harder. Service control reduces unnecessary background activity so the workstation is not doing more than it needs to do. For a beginner, this topic matters because it shows that security is not only about advanced tools or complicated attacks. Very often, preventable compromise happens because basic settings were left too loose for too long. When technicians understand that small login choices, firmware choices, and service choices can have a large effect, they are much better prepared to build safer workstations and to keep common mistakes from turning into real security problems.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.